I want to ask the question of like, when you enter this space, when you enter this community center, you know, we're thinking about vulnerability, and I'm thinking like, well, what is vulnerability? Like, you are entering this space, but when I think of vulnerability, like, it has this connotation that like, it stems from being in fear of something, and affecting like their well-being, and like affecting their well-being and feeling like they're in danger. But I'm also interested in exploring vulnerability. Like, is it more than just an emotional state? Is it a quality almost, like a quality that exists alongside joy, where it generates that discussion, and it generates like this feeling, this building of trust between researchers and the community themselves. So that's also something that I'm interested in relation to the symposium. And how are these qualities, like how are they shaped and amplified by different stages and modes of migration, and like how does tech build into that as well? And I'm also, I had some conversations with some of you already this morning about how so many of us want to take this course with an anthropologist at the University of Michigan named Ruth Behar. She wrote this book in 1996 titled The Vulnerable Observer, and she and I quote, "If you as a researcher can't stop the horror, shouldn't you at least document it?" End quote. So I'm also thinking about that as well. And by revisiting these interview recordings and audiovisual material of the border crossing journey shared by my participants for the purposes of analysis, I've developed these journal prompts that address these inquiries at depth and provide the grounds for sharing knowledge with relevant audiences, such as secondary school students, and developing strategies for humanitarian support. So yeah, one of the most important lessons that I have learned since my return from the field is that by sharing my own vulnerability with my participants, whether it's as an outsider, a listener, a woman, and a daughter of Honduran migrants, and by bearing witness to moments of extreme risk, people can foster connections that recognize one another's human dignity and promote emotional well-being. And I'm very excited for the ensuing collaboration, the pedagogy workshop that we'll have, because I feel that adolescents, and many of them being my participants, are very well within the capacity to exercise the empathic skills necessary to conduct meaningful fieldwork with migrants. So it's more of it's an open question that I have really with this presentation. So what is vulnerability and why are we here? So yes, thank you. I hope this works. Okay.
So our next presenter is going to be Leah Squires from the University of Michigan. The title of the presentation in Spanish is Nexo Clima, Migración en el Oriente Medio y África del Norte, the Climate Migration Nexus in the Middle East and North Africa.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm a master's student with the Center for Middle East and North African Area Studies at the University of Michigan, but I'm also receiving my master's in public policy from the Ford School of Public Policy at Michigan. So to this research, I bring a policy lens to everything that I do for the most part, and I'm really interested in how policy is used, how it hinders, how it shapes these questions of vulnerabilities in vulnerable populations. Specifically, this idea of my research that I wanted to talk about today looks at this climate migration nexus, specifically in the Middle East and North Africa, because that is my regional focus. And the second part of this title, Developing Community-Informed Policy, I probably won't speak much of it today. It's an emerging element of my research and largely focuses on my belief that impacted communities should be driving and informing the policy-making process, that it's not something that should just be happening among the upper echelons of government. The research questions that I wanted to think about, broadly speaking, and I should interject that the first part of this presentation is going to be doing a brief overview of the research, and then I'll be talking about some pedagogical applications that I had some ideas for before attending the conference, but like Sylvia, I'm looking forward to the collaborative element happening later in the day. So the research questions that I wanted to ask was, how is the relationship between climate change and migration reflected in current policy making? What do policy debates reveal about the climate migration nexus? And how do researchers and policymakers use data to prove that climate change is impacting displacement? I think these are important questions to be asking right now. Currently in the discourse, in public debate, there's a growing call for climate refugees or environment migrants, and this is something that has captured the attention of many people, including myself. And so I wanted to consider these questions in relation to that particular debate as to whether or not there should be a particular status for people displaced by climate change. And when I talk about status, this relates back to the 1951 Refugee Convention, which is reliant on a well-founded fear of persecution, specifically related to somebody's status pertaining to their race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion. So right now, displacement by climate change is not a protected, or any environmental hazard is not a protected class. And so this is where my policy lens comes into play, because this classification that we see really impacts people on a day-to-day level, even though it's encoded in our legal processes. The methodology that I used was, again, using the Middle East and North Africa as a geographic case study. I also brought in some specific research related to Morocco, as I'd done some review of water policy in Morocco previously, and I looked at a mixture of literature, reports, policies, and white papers, and these were coming from academics, from NGOs, intergovernmental organizations, and also governments. So there were a number of things that I took away from this review. Probably the biggest takeaway for me is that current policy making in the MENA region typically does not account for a relationship between climate change and migration. So what that means in policymaking is you'll have separate statutes, procedures specific to migration, and separate ones specific to climate change, adaptation, or environment, or agriculture maybe. But they're not integrated. It's not an integrated approach at this point. And part of the reason for that is that the majority of research has established, I would say, common understanding around the complexity and multi-causal driving forces in the climate migration nexus. So migration happens, or movement happens, for a number of reasons. You know, we can talk about different push-pull factors for why people move, why they're forced to move, and different people, different populations have different reasons for that. Climate change itself is also very multifaceted. When we look at slow onset events like drought, which is very common in the Middle East and North Africa, compared to rapid onset events like we might have seen here in Puerto Rico with Hurricane Maria or the more recent earthquake. So there's a lot in play in both of these fields. Underlying that, there's an uncertainty of data. Among climate change data, there is actually readily reliable environmental data in the MENA region specific to issues like drought and decreased rainfall. But there are still, unfortunately, plenty of climate change deniers. And people will use this uncertainty or idea of unreliability about climate data as a way to avoid action to change climate or environment-related policies. We also see an unreliability of migration data, specifically that within the MENA region, there is more statistics on cross-border migration, so international migration, for example, people in Morocco going to Morocco and vice versa, while most people in Middle East, North Africa affected by climate shocks are going to be internally displaced, and so be moving within their countries of origin rather than crossing borders necessarily. And that data is currently lacking. And so this lack of data can be a way for governments to avoid integrating new policy, but it also means that we don't see a lot of conversation between these two policy branches. So specifically to Morocco, and this is just the example that I was looking at, some of the climate threats that they face are rising temperatures and increased drought. Previously, you might see a drought in Morocco one every 5 years in the 1990s. That's pretty much, we're at about a drought every other year since 2012. You also have in Morocco competing environmental and agricultural policy frameworks. Agriculture makes up about 14% of Morocco's GDP, but employs almost 40% of the labor force. So agriculture is still a huge part of Morocco's economy, and it's also it exacerbates the water stress that Morocco already faces. And it is the policies that the Department of Agriculture have put in place are not aligned with what the Department of Sustainable Development, there are a couple other letters as part of that acronym that I'm forgetting at the moment. And so they're not aligned. Then you also have a separate, in 2014, Morocco introduced the National Strategy on Immigration and Asylum. I believe, based on my research, that this was the first example of at a state level of a immigration policy within the Middle East and North Africa. This policy, though, specifically targets international migration again, and specifically targets transit migrants. So Morocco has increasingly become a transitory migrant country, with sub-Saharan Africans coming through Morocco to embark, hopefully, to Europe. And so again, this policy is not addressing Moroccans who are displaced by drought within their own country. And so you have separate, distinct frameworks for talking about these questions. So some of my key takeaways in thinking about this research is that migration decision-making and environmental hazards are very context specific in terms of what the hazards are and how they impact communities, and also how people talk about their decisions to move, whether or not they attribute it to an environmental shock, whether or not it's for economic purposes, or some other reason. So there's a lot of moving pieces. My belief that impacted populations should inform policy that addresses their movement. And there's also this growing need, or this current need for, I think, more theoretical frameworks and reliable data to be able to talk about this, both in the policy sphere and also in the political sphere, because for better or for worse, there's still a reliance on data to mobilize action and change policy, even with a large and loud public cry for change. And as part of that, looking to national and local governments to adopt policy responses for both mobile and immobile populations affected by climate shocks. And for me, this really gets at the question of vulnerability, particular to this conference, is that not everybody has the option to move or the capability to move. So remembering that when we're talking about people impacted by an environmental shock, you're going to have people who are trapped populations, people who decide to stay because they don't want to leave, even if it might be in their best interest or safety, people who have the financial, both the capital and human social networks to move. So there are a lot of different populations that we're actually talking about when we're discussing vulnerable populations. So thinking about this in terms of curriculum development and the pedagogical workshop, and why we're here for this next couple days, I specifically framed this idea of curriculum development for Puerto Rican students, but I think these same lessons could probably be applied in Michigan and also be adapted to a more Michigan-specific context, as Michigan also faces its own climate threats from air pollution, water, gas pipelines between Michigan and Canada, so lots to work with and explore there. But thinking about climate shocks and displacement in Puerto Rico and why my research is relevant to this context, I was really grateful for the opening keynote because I felt like it helped set the stage for some of the things I wanted to talk about, so I won't repeat what was said earlier today. But with after Hurricane Maria and the earthquake, I think these are two examples, or two salient examples of how climate shocks affect Puerto Rico. And I think it makes relevant this conversation about displacement and the impact that our changing environment has on people's mobility. When I was thinking about curriculum goals, I want students to understand the impact of policy on their livelihoods. I think policy is often something that is thought of as inaccessible, something that's stale, as something that is not citizen-centered, and I don't think that has to be true. And so I want that civic engagement to be happening in the schools. I want students to explore the intersection between environmental factors and migratory decision-making. So right now, those two discussions tend to be more siloed, and I want to focus on curriculum development and policy debate if I can make that kind of influence that bring those conversations together. I want lessons that facilitate learning across cultural contexts, and then thinking specifically in the classroom, I think that there would be a focus on reading and writing skills, specifically with this pedagogy. I also want to mention that I think particular to this content, there would be a need for trauma-informed curriculum in any of the examples that I'm going to be discussing next, and that would need to be reflected and integrated across the lessons. So I have 3 examples. The first is pedagogy policy analysis. So I imagine this would be for an advanced 12th grade group that looks at where students actually evaluate current policy in Puerto Rico at local and federal levels. I was considering that students could consider pre and post Maria policymaking. How has policy changed? Has it not changed since Hurricane Maria, and giving students the opportunity to develop recommendations as part of this curriculum based on their learnings. I think this is really important. For example, more than 1.1 million Puerto Ricans who registered for support from FEMA after Hurricane Maria. 2 out of 5 applicants were deemed ineligible for different types of assistance. That's a policy issue because you have to have a certain level of status or meet certain requirements, and all of that is built into the policy and the standards set by FEMA. So do those need to be changed? Do they actually reflect the conditions that Puerto Ricans face when threatened by a hurricane or by an earthquake? So this is one option. For a high school audience, I think, and this could be scaled to address different grade levels, I wanted to look at a comparative plan that looked at differences and similarities between Puerto Rico and the Pacific Islands. The Pacific Islands are on the forefront of this conversation about climate refugees and how classificatory hierarchies dictate someone's access to resources, someone's ability to move. The first case of applying for asylum as a climate refugee was back in 2015. by Mr. Yoene Tessiota. He's from a small Pacific island called Kiribati, and it's one of 5 or 6 Pacific islands most at risk for becoming uninhabitable due to rising sea level. So it's one of the islands that will actually disappear potentially by 2050. In 2015, he was denied asylum in New Zealand. Most recently, in 2020, the UN Human Rights Commission ruled that his life was not at imminent risk, so they did not grant him refugee status of any kind. They did not open that door. However, they did say that sending him back to Kiribati from, I think this was from Australia at this point, would put his life at risk, which is in violation of the International Convention for Civil and Political Rights. So they were using a different policy, a different legal instrument to make their decision. So I imagine designing, that's just a brief context for the Pacific Islands and what they're facing. And so what I imagine for this lesson would be designing different vignettes from both a Puerto Rican perspective and a Pacific Islander perspective, using different media sources, different reports, for students to draw out comparisons with an emphasis maybe on rhetoric and oral argumentation and writing at the end. The last, which I think could, example which I think could be adapted to a middle school classroom, would be based on a simulation. And this one I actually thought, given my own interests, I wanted to bring in a different cultural context, and thinking about a Moroccan-based simulation where small groups are given scenarios and they have to decide a course of action. And so they can choose to migrate. There's this idea of forced displacement, whether they're trapped where they are or whether they're immobile, based on the specific markers that they're given in their simulation. And I think something like this is actually really important to see how a student's own experience and context informs how they consider another cultural context. So that was my framing for this particular application. And with that, I would go to questions, but I know Esma's up next, so we'll come back to that. Thank you.
Our last presenter of the panel is Asma Norai. The title of her paper is U.S. Human Rights Abuses During the Iraq War.
Oh, I got it.
Okay. Hello, my name is Asma. I'm a second-year master's student at the Center for Middle Eastern and North African Studies, like Leah. My presentation title shifted a little bit. Us as academics or aspiring academics are always looking for catchy titles for our presentations. So I got this from an interview that I recently watched with former Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, talking about torture practices during the Iraq War, and he likens torture practices at the military site of Abu Ghraib that I'm going to be speaking about today to a chaotic animal house on the night shift. And my argument is that the practices that we saw at Abu Ghraib, the torture practices that were used during the Iraq War, are not the result of sort of rogue actors acting on their own, but rather a result of a broader system of dehumanization and othering that was part of US political rhetoric and law and policy at the time. So just to give you a little bit of background about my research interests more broadly, I think about my research is at the intersection of human rights and comparative literature. And in comparative literature, I've been looking at the emerging genre of surrealist and science fiction writing from post-2003 Iraq. This presentation is mostly focusing on US political rhetoric, law, and policy, as I said, but if you're interested in more of the comparative literature side, I can talk about that later on. And this has really been the inspiration of my interest in Iraq and the Iraq War. So this is a quote from one of my favorite writers from the Iraqi community, and one of his most famous compilation of short stories called The Corpse Exhibition and Other Stories of Iraq. So it says, I wanted to reach back to the other times I might have lived in, the traces of which are scattered to places I previously thought imaginary. So the aftermath of the Iraq War, despite the fact that it was presented as sort of this democratizing, civilizing mission, the reality is that it has resulted in thousands of deaths, both on the American and Iraqi sides, left the country in political, economic, social shambles, and led to the displacement of more than 4 million people internally and abroad. But I think what this quote reflects is that in the midst of all this fragmentation, there's also a community that's struggling with how to make sense of its individual and shared trauma that has resulted from the war. And I hope that my work will be a small piece in building together this puzzle of what actually occurred both during and leading up to the Iraq War, and to illuminate a broader process of dehumanization that I think is applicable to almost all instances of systemic violence. Okay. Some context about Iraq. This is a map of where Iraq is located in the Middle East. So next to Saudi Arabia, Syria, Iran, if you're not familiar. Baghdad is the capital city, and that's a picture taken from downtown Baghdad in 2003. So the Iraq War was really predicated at the time in 2002, 2003 on creating this connection between the oppressive regime of Saddam Hussein at the time and finding a scapegoat for the fear that was instilled in US population in the aftermath of 9/11. So this is a speech given by President George W. Bush talking about the justification for the invasion of Iraq, and he creates a connection between terrorist groups and the Saddam Hussein regime. So I can just read it for you guys. The Iraqi regime possesses and produces chemical and biological weapons. It has given shelter and support to terrorism and practices terror against its own people. On September 11, 2011, America felt its vulnerability even to threats that gather on the other side of the earth. We resolved then, we are resolved today to confront every threat from any source that could bring sudden terror and suffering to America. Members of Congress of both political parties and members of the United Nations Security Council agree that Saddam Hussein is a threat to peace and must be disarmed. So then he concludes by saying, we agree that the Iraqi dictator must not be permitted to threaten America and the world with horrible poisons and diseases and gases and atomic weapons. What I think was particularly interesting about this speech was how he concludes and he says, since we all agree on this goal, the goal being that Saddam Hussein should be ousted, given his connection with 9/11, the issue is how best can we achieve this goal? And my question in my work is, who is the we and who is the they? And how is he, President Bush, and the broader U.S. senior administration at the time defining as agree? What does agreeing look like? What are we actually agreeing on? And at what and whose costs is this goal going to be achieved or not achieved? So what I focus my research on is the fact that the justification for the Iraq War at the time was very much predicated on creating a narrow binary between dispensable Iraqi life and an idealized American nationalist identity. So another speech that I looked at was the State of the Union address in 2002. And it's very vivid in its nationalistic imagery that creates notions of American idealism, sacrifice, cultural icons that are, what I'm arguing, creating a very narrow definition of what is defined as American identity and what is defined as American values. So for example, some of the imagery used in the speech are the story of a boy that leaves his football and a note to his lost father at the 9/11 memorial, the story of a grieving father who lost 2 sons in the deadly attack, and then military personnel who are ready to protect the nations against a future attack. And what I think is interesting about these images is not simply their use to define American identity, but the fact that they're thereafter immediately juxtaposed against an imagined Iraqi identity that's presented as a monolith and that presents a perceived existential threat to these American ideals that have been presented. When Iraqis are not presented as existential threats to the preservation of American ideals, they are infantilized and seen as incapable of bringing about their own political and social change without the intervention of American or other Western forces. So in justifying the intervention of Iraq, President Bush also strips the Iraqi population of their own agency and makes an effort to portray the invasion as a sort of welcomed attempt to support Iraqi people in a process that they would have already undergone themselves. So this is one of the most famous images from the Iraq War, the falling of Saddam Hussein's statue in Baghdad. So the U.S. military soldiers are the agents and the actors in this photo. The Iraqi population is sort of static, represented by the statue of a leader that might not necessarily represent the population more broadly. We also don't see his face. It's covered by the American flag. So I think it evokes questions about how we're thinking about Iraqi agency, how we're thinking about what the choice of a community would have actually been if it hadn't been for Western intervention. So what I'm arguing is that this dual narrative becomes important in establishing the foundations for treating individuals outside the framework of those deserving fundamental human rights, and then also simultaneously still maintaining a narrative of U.S. moral superiority. So in 2004, the New Yorker published a very scathing and graphic account of prisoner abuse at the U.S. military prison of Abu Ghraib. This picture is from that article. Abu Ghraib actually used to be a prison site under the Saddam Hussein regime as well, where his political prisoners were also held captive and tortured. So photos released from Abu Ghraib, when it was under US military control, showed the participations of US soldiers in daily acts of physical and emotional abuse, including forced nudity, sexual exploitation, waterboarding, electrocution, and much more that I won't go into for the purposes of not making this too graphic. What's interesting and also very painful to me about these photographs is the ways in which the treatment of prisoners is portrayed by the US soldiers in this context as a normalized part of everyday life and just part of their duty. So I think this is the result of that critical failure to see Iraqi life as life and as human. I analyzed a documentary called Ghosts of Abu Ghraib that does interviews with the US soldiers involved in these photographs, and a lot of them, when asked to explain why or how they justified these actions to themselves, would talk about it as if it was just a routine part of everyday life that you just do and don't talk about. One woman compared it to something like going to the dentist. You don't like it, but it's scheduled, and you just do it, and you don't think about it, and you get over it. So my question is, what is the context that creates an environment where people who are everyday people like us, who have families, have the capacity for empathy? What creates the environment and the conditions for them to treat other human beings such as this, and to see that as a normalized part of everyday life? And I think this is where we really need to create a connection between the actions of everyday people and then a broader discourse of policy and law that justifies abusive practices. So this is a memoranda sent by the Department of Justice to the President in 2002. It's part of a group of documents called the Torture Memos. And the torture memos effectively invalidated, reinterpreted, and reconfigured existing international law and human rights to make it so that the torture practices that we saw in the previous picture were defined as lawful interrogation methods. And so they are effectively rendered invisible within the language of international law and human rights itself. So some quotes that I pulled out from that, from two of the torture memos, are: the victim must experience intense pain or suffering of the kind that is equivalent to the pain that would be associated with serious physical injuries so severe that death, organ failure, or permanent damage resulting in the loss of significant body functions will likely result. So that is how torture is being defined. And as long as the actions taken by the US government in this context don't lead to severe death, organ failure, they're not technically considered torture under the enhanced interrogation framework. Another one rendered the Geneva Conventions basically inapplicable in the context of the Iraq War, because it was said that the Geneva Conventions applied to enemy prisoners that were abiding to standard methods of war, and because the Iraq War is presented as a war against non-state terrorist actors that are not a party to the Geneva Conventions, the US government then also has no obligation to abide by those conventions. So the aftermath of Abu Ghraib is that despite the publications of these photographs that are extremely horrific, caused quite a bit of international shock in the moment in which they were published, there hasn't been much strategic change, policy change in the aftermath. People responsible for things like the torture memos have not been held accountable. John Yoo, who was a senior lawyer at the Department of Justice at the time, currently teaches at Harvard Law School. The senior officials in the intelligence and military community have maintained their positions or been promoted. And the low-level soldiers that were implicated in the photographs some of them have served very short sentences, but there's been a lack of willingness to connect the instance of Abu Ghraib to a broader systemic environment of dehumanization that justified the invasion itself and also the practices that followed after. So the dominant narrative right now around Abu Ghraib, I would argue, is still one that likens this incident to a sort of scandal that was the result of sadistic actors, like I said, chaotic Animal House on the night shift that were not acting on behalf of the US government. But I would argue in order for instances like this to not be repeated in the future, there needs to be a connection between the negotiated attempt in law and policy to blur the lines between torture, lawful interrogation methods, who is human, who is not, who is American, who is a threat to America, and why. And just to conclude, I also really appreciated the framing of vulnerability at the beginning of today's symposium. So I'm thinking about how that connects to my talk and thinking about vulnerability and visibility. Visibility, does an image like the one we saw from Abu Ghraib actually inspire more empathy, or does it, because of our political framework, does it actually create another step in the process of dehumanization? And can invisibility actually in certain contexts be powerful? And how does visibility in certain contexts render people incapable of acting on their own political agency? Thank you.
So we might have time later for maybe one or two questions. I know that we're late, we're hungry, and we're gonna, of course, keep the conversation going outside, but does anybody have any questions for any of the presenters?
I have a question to Sylvia. Yeah, I know. So I think it's really interesting to look at how like people are using technologies to like to think about the strategy of migration. And I wonder if you are planning to use the apps, like and how people are using the apps to think about the strategy of migration. I'm saying this because when you think about the migration between Puerto Rico and mainland states, or Latin American countries and U.S., I read some books about sexual orientations, like motivating not a few people, motivations to go to North America, partly because to achieve the better self-realization, and partly because to access the better healthcare, especially when they get HIV. So. I think one research cannot do anything, and of course it depends on your interest. But if I wonder, if you have any thoughts about how people are using dating apps to potentially, benefit from securing sort of relationships with people in North America, because marriage could be one kind of a powerful tool to gain the citizenship and legal status to the kind of developed country. If you're in developing country, if I were to use that expression.
Sure. So I would say in the past 10 years, when Facebook became a dominant social network for the American population, many Central American migrants living in their home countries would leverage their relationships with families living in the United States through Facebook. And they would be exposed to a certain picture that people tend to draw of life in U.S. culture, and of hey, I have a car, which is considered a luxury in the Northern Triangle. So there's a certain idealistic portrayal offered offered on apps and social media platforms like Facebook. And that has implications for further, creating that. It's like a magnet that makes people want to leave their countries because they see this idealistic portrayal. But I'm also interested in how recently people are leveraging communication tools like WhatsApp, which is owned by Facebook, and how it's like a capacity building platform that was not really planned by designers like WhatsApp to coordinate communication on a large scale to migrate. So these are active questions that I'm exploring. But again, on the flip side of the benefits of communication tech like Facebook and WhatsApp is also the level of miscommunication that can be spread through these platforms. So these are all active questions that I'm exploring.
And quickly, maybe if the fear of the persecution in the home country is one of the main factors to drive those migrants, maybe you can also think about gendered image, you migrate to say North America to be saved by the powerful say white male, for example, even if that's not the reality, the kind of the going to developed country to be protected and to be part of the powerful self, which is kind of citizens of the developed country, which is in many cases related to the image of a masculine male. I mean, I'm thinking about discourse of the Japanese people, especially Japanese women who migrate to North America, because it's migration is kind of very gendered, and the motivation to go to North America is kind of finding a strong or stable powerful male figure. So just thoughts about things.
Another question, comments? And again, we can continue session outside. There's lunch for everybody, and after lunch we can come back. I wanted to make one important point. So it was actually a name that I mentioned earlier in the morning. So we would not be here if it wasn't for the fact that 6 years ago, one person imagined, created, constructed, wrote, and I was actually witness to the writing proposal sessions at 1 in the morning on Sunday nights. So I did want to acknowledge the presence of Dr. Lenny Oreña Valerio, who's on the back, who's the original creator of this, and not be here now, assistant director of the Center for Latin American Studies at the University of Florida. So we have the source, the creator, has blessed us with her presence. So we'll break for lunch, and maybe at 2:15 to 20 we'll come back for Darren's taller pedagógico. Okay? So 2:15 to 20, very strictly. Right.
Ay, para saber cuál es.